Hi, this is a short presentation on the contact and experience that Queen Mary, Queen of Scots, had with the Shire of Argyll in the 16th century. Uh, we're going to look at the main characters in the relationship between the Queen and Argyll, and then the events that happened to these people during the stormy period of her life and reign. And to finish, we'll look at how our characters' lives came to a conclusion. So let's start with looking at Mary herself. Born to James V and the French Queen Mary of Guise. And fortunately, her father, James V, died just a few days after her birth, leaving a huge power vacuum in Scotland and British and European power plays. As required, as the next in line to the Stuart dynasty, she was crowned king at Stirling Castle as a baby, and the management and control of Scotland started off with her mother, Mary of Guise, taking over as regent. Just a quick look at Mary's perception of herself, and this comes through strongly in the many, many letters that she wrote to the Earls of Argyll and to other nobles in Scotland, as well as to friends in England, Queen Elizabeth I, and her cousins and family in France. So Mary has left a large trail of correspondence, which gives some insight to her personality. Here we are seeing Mary writing in English. She describes herself as Marie, as her first language was French, and the R is Reine in French for Queen, or Regina in Latin. And it says it's a letter to Queen Elizabeth I, written in 1560, and it says, "Your right good sister and cousin, Marie Reine." So Mary's early life is a comfortable one, and her experiences at the courts in France would affect her and her expectations for the rest of her life. She's a very fortunate princess and queen, and lives her life accordingly. Our next character uh, we're going to have a look at is Archibald Campbell, who is the son of the Archibald Campbells. Makes it quite confusing because many of the Campbells of Argyll are called Archibald. His father died, and Archibald took over as a young man. He has found himself heading up Scotland's largest, most powerful clan, and a family that occupied most of the key positions in the Scottish Parliament and in the Church of Scotland. We're in the middle and height of the Reformation in Scotland at this time, and Archibald is a forward leader of the Protestant movements, one of the most powerful men in Scotland. It's his business to see and oversee how Scotland is run and how she relates with England and with states overseas. We know that the Shire of Argyll funded him to go to speak to Mary after the death of her husband, the Dauphin. And Campbell invites Mary to return as a Catholic to run to become the Queen of the Protestant Scotland. In 1554, he married Lady Jane, or Jean Stuart, who was the natural daughter of James V. This is a marriage which was arranged a year before, not necessarily either his choice or Lady Jean's choice, but it was felt that Clan Campbell favoured arranged marriages with the Stuart dynasty to be close to the throne. And we'll hear later about how that went. But let's meet Jean Stuart. She was born in 1533. The natural daughter of James V, as we mentioned, and her mother was Elizabeth Beaton, or Bethune, one of the ladies in waiting to Marie of Guise. And Jean and her mother enjoyed life at the Scottish court in Edinburgh. She's 9 years older than her half-sister Mary, but we believe she may have visited Mary in France, and certainly was close to her sister when Mary returned. And as we have mentioned already, when in 1554 she entered into an arranged marriage with Archibald. So let's go on to look at Mary's time in France, because this is the changeover where the death of the Dauphin in 1558 created a dynamic split in the French monarchy. Catherine de Medici had no interest in Mary staying, as she has plans for one of her other sons to take over from the Dauphin, and he would be the king. So Mary was not required in France anymore, and following the rejection by his mother, she made plans to return to Scotland as a young woman. She returned to Leith, and they became reunited with her homeland. Argyll was one of the nobles, with Maitland and others, that met her in Edinburgh. She stayed at Lamb's house in Edinburgh. She was reunited with her half-sister Jean, and entered and set up a new, more vibrant court at Palace of Holyrood and at Craigmillar. Mary did not travel lightly, and her return from France involved dozens of courtiers and specialist supporters and jewelers and jesters and so on to swell her numbers. So great were they in Edinburgh that the area around Craigmillar is still known as Little France. As Jean and Mary were close, Mary thought that she could have a part to play in building and rebuilding her failed marriage with Archibald Campbell. So we'll talk a bit now about her visit. It happened in the summer of 1563. Mary sailed from Dumbarton, and we reckon arrived at Loch Goil by sea and overland to the castle at Inverary. Archibald and Lady Jean had moved from their premises in the castle to allow Queen Mary to have the best rooms. There would also be massive extensions made and massive improvements made into the ancient castle. It's not the castle that we know of today in Inverary, but a much older one. So this is the route that she's taken on horseback with a large entourage. She would normally have round about 20 to 30 horses and 10 or 12 pack mules to carry her possessions, plus all the staff that she needed to maintain her royal way of life, no matter where and no matter how small the premises were that she was visiting. So let's have a look at some of the staff that might go on these journeys, like the one to Inverary. The master of the household, of course, would have made arrangements well in advance, and she would be accompanied by round about 16 or so femmes de chambre. These are her ladies in waiting. The master of the Queen's horses is an important player. He has arranged stabling at all the points for the horses to be fed and attended to. And that's how we know so much about her visits, because he kept accounts of what he was paying on all these journeys. So the itinerary is quite well recorded. So many horses required grooms, and of course Mary's taste was more to French cuisine and fine cooking, so she would be accompanied by her chef and a master cook. But she also had a perfumier, apothecaries, jesters, I've mentioned already. So there would be a large party of probably 40 or 50 people on this trip to Argyll. But not only were there lots of people involved, Mary also required a lot of luggage. Even though she was only there for about 7 or 8 days, she would take a wardrobe of over 60 dresses. These would include hunting outfits, as she liked to hunt, and the Argyll and the Cowell Forest were famous for their deer and boar hunting. We don't know if she had time to do so on this short trip, but certainly she probably was carrying suitable clothing if she was going to do that. She also enjoyed sports, so there would be clothes for potentially for playing golf, which not likely in Argyll in the 16th century, but it's a possibility. Certainly she would have an outfit for morning, afternoons, evenings, and plus the specialist clothing for receiving noble guests, court gowns. She had an enormous jewellery collection, and that would accompany her on all her journeys. And a library, again, only there for 7 days, but we know that the library, perhaps in the region of 300 books, would be accompanying her on the trip as well. So it's a well equipped, almost a mini court on the move on her journey to visit Argyll. At Inverary, the purpose of the visit was implemented. Jean took it upon herself to talk to Mary about her issues with Archibald, and Mary invited a male advisor to speak to Archibald about his behaviour, and her choice for the sympathetic task was John Knox. So hopefully that was a robust conversation that Archibald may have taken on board. He certainly didn't have any grudges with Knox, and there's records of them corresponding and meeting in Edinburgh quite regularly until the Earl's death. After her visit to her half-sister and her brother-in-law, she would sail by ferry to Port Cregan. We know this today in Argyll as the Cregans. The local laird was Ivor McFun, and he had the largest house at a place called Drip, which is in the forest of Glenbranter, just behind Strathclyde. And at that visit, Mr. McFun took the opportunity to transfer all his lands in Argyll. Many of them were in dispute because they'd been acquired by fair means and foul. But he gave title to all of these lands to his queen, and Queen Mary then switched round to his McFun's son Charles and gave him full royal approval and ownership of these lands, disputed and undisputed. The document is called a claret constat, and Charles McFun gained massively by having this royal approval and would stand him in good stead for generations. After the Strathclyde visit, she headed to Strone, which is on Loch Fyne, and either by ferry from Strone, she travelled to the royal castle at Dunoon. Castles existed from about the 13th century and is a royal castle kept by various clans over the generations, but at that time the keepers were Clan Campbell. The castle, we believe, was enormous, not just a military force, but also a mini palace, because many royals and senior chieftains would stay there, which they wouldn't do if it was a grim place. She had some time for some hunting here, and we know from the keepers of the castle that Lady Jane often escaped from Inverary and her husband and stayed here with some reasonable accommodation at Dunoon Castle. So she would know it. Jane would know the castle very well. And heading south the next day down to Toward, she visited Duncan Lamont, the 11th chief of Clan Lamont, one of the smaller clans in the littoral of Argyll. Toward Castle was decorated for the Queen's arrival, including the addition of a very finely carved arch, which is shown in the bottom left of the painting. Duncan Lamont was married to Isabel Stewart, and we don't know if there was any connection to royalty. Stewart's a common name in Bute and around that area. And at the end of her visit to Toward, her visit to Argyll was completed, and she returned by ferry to Fairlie on the mainland of Scotland. Now we need to move on, and as life in Scotland is becoming more complicated for Mary, and life in Scotland is made more complicated by Mary and her marriages. So let's move on and have a look at that. In 1565, she married her cousin, Henry Darnley. He was a very tall, lanky teenager of 19. She was a young woman of 22. Mary, we know, was Catholic and practiced Catholic faith, and Darnley has fallen out perhaps with his Catholic faith and become a Protestant, but perhaps not a very secure one. Lady Jane, the Countess of Argyll, and her half-sister attended the wedding, and as some recognition of Lady Jane's standing, she was a proxy for Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth I, and presented the married couple with a gold bowl at the gift from the Queen of England. Darnley is a headstrong, ambitious young man, now married to the Queen, and feels that he can now behave and take over the mantle of King of Scotland. However, Scotland had slightly different ideas about this, and as the married life became more complicated, the royal couple fell out of favour, and the sequence of events goes something like this. The royal court were sitting at Holyrood Palace, the Palace of Holyrood, in March 1566. Queen Mary was there with her secretary, an Italian Darnley, as an Italian Rizzio, and he is subject to a very violent attack by a number of Scottish nobles, with Darnley present. The Queen is 6 months pregnant at this stage and under great risk, so she receives protection from her ladies, and we know the legend has it that Lady Jane, the Countess of Argyll, and her mother were present, and Lady Jane made great contribution to making sure the Queen was safe by removing candles and burning tables, cloths, and so on, to try to make this confined space as safe as she could for her Queen. In 1566, James was born, and Mary and Darnley's plans for the monarchy were strongly opposed. They had ambitions of relationships with England and with Europe. Mary had started to talk about a claim to the English throne, which was alarming, and Darnley was beginning to upset the senior Scottish lords with his overbearing behaviour and potentially overtones of residual Catholicism. So they are no longer a popular couple, a popular monarchy. Just when you thought it couldn't get any worse, Mary, disappointed with her married life with Darnley, begins a liaison with James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. He is a strong-willed, ambitious man, and who felt that he had a claim to be king. And unfortunately, coincided with the murder of Darnley at the Kirk of Fields in Edinburgh in 1567. So conveniently, Darnley is removed, and the responsibility for his death is never fully resolved, but there were many suspicions about who would gain from this, and one of the characters who might gain was Bothwell himself, who is now with the Queen regarded as potential murderers. Not helped by the fact that Mary was very swift to marry Bothwell, and this was the last straw for the Scottish Parliament. Mary's supporters were brushed aside at Carbery by the national forces, and Mary was taken to in secure prison at Lochleven Castle. We know that she escaped. The attempt to use armed force to retain her position was overwhelmed, and by July that year, she is forced to abdicate. There is an escape from prison. Amongst her supporters now stepping out to be visible include Archibald Campbell, the 5th Earl of Argyll, and he believes with others that he can restore Mary to the throne. The control of Scotland is now with the hands of Mary's half-brother, James Stuart, the Earl of Murray, and the 2 family members, backed up with an army supporting Mary of about 8,000 and an army for Murray of around 6,000, and they meet at Langside on the south side of Glasgow. There's a tapestry in the library at Langside, which is certainly worth seeing, which displays the full scene. The slide here shows Mary on a white charger talking to or listening to Archibald Campbell, the Earl of Argyll, who's on her right-hand side. Unfortunately, Archibald appears to have had recurring health problems, and he passes out within the first half hour of the battle forming up. This leads to disarray amongst Mary's supporters as they've lost their general, and Mary's army is easily pushed aside by the Earl of Murray. And at this point, Mary, for some reason, decides to abandon Scotland, even though she had a significant support and could easily have escaped and fought another day. But she decides to escape to England and seek the help of her cousin Elizabeth, the Queen Elizabeth I. And she rode south. Unknown to her at the time, she was riding into 19 years of imprisonment and eventual execution for this act. So probably about the worst decision, and that she did make many bad decisions, but this was probably the worst one. She wrote to Argyll almost daily. The royal letters at the archives at Inverary Castle are full of affectionate letters from Mary to Archibald as she moved from castle to castle down through the borders and on to Derby and Northamptonshire, where she would spend the rest of her life. So what happens at the end of the day? Mary is headed off into England. Archibald eventually managed to divorce Jean in 1573. He must have been very keen to end the marriage because there was no particular process for that during the 16th century. However, he managed to establish at the Scottish Court and the Scottish Parliament a method of doing this, and that method, strangely enough, was based on the cause of desertion. He divorces her on the grounds of her desertion, and the legal process assembled to do that actually continued to apply in Scotland until 1967. He then immediately married Lady Janet Cunningham, who I suspect would have been his first choice many years ago before entering the arranged marriage with Lady Jean. He marries Lady Janet, and unfortunately he died 6 weeks later from a disease of the stone, which we think is kidney stones, and possibly a condition he'd suffered from for many years. He's aged 40, 41, still a relatively not young man for Scotland at the time, but a man with many more years left in him. Died early. Buried at the Campbell Mausoleum in Kilmun, on the shores of the Holy Loch in Argyll. His standing in Scotland can still be seen because he has an enormous epitaph which praises his responsibility for the church and the Protestant church being established in Scotland, and how grateful people in Argyll and Scotland are to his marvellous efforts to make this key change in the church, and also in the running and control of Scotland. He was always at the centre of what was going on. So he dies a young man. Mary's mission to achieve recognition by Elizabeth I as her proper heir was totally unsuccessful, and Queen Elizabeth appears to have had, after 19 years of being bothered by this activity, is sort of shuffled into agreeing to the execution of Mary. And she was beheaded in the Peterborough at Fotheringay Castle in December 1587, and buried nearby at Peterborough Cathedral. Her son James had by this point become James VI of Scotland, and after the death of Queen Elizabeth, the resolution of succession was, ironically, that Mary's son would take over as King of England. So the Stuarts got there eventually and became king. They had the united unity of the thrones of Scotland, England, and Ireland. James had not had a particularly successful childhood because of all the murders and mysteries and wars and so on that we've been speaking about, and kept himself out of the debate between Mary and Elizabeth, and commenters at the time talked about the effect on his behaviour, his personality. He was, although a very talented and able man, he was also quite nervous around people, and quite perhaps eccentric. However, he'd been an able King of Scotland and did a reasonable job in maintaining a continuity of the royalty after 1603. So he felt he could. What he did do for his mother, he didn't do very much, but he did have her remains transferred from Peterborough to the royal vaults at Westminster Abbey in 1612. So he wasn't in a hurry to do anything for her, because he'd been king for 9 years at that point. But she now rests where perhaps she should be, which is in Westminster Abbey. Lady Jane survived the two of them and died in 1588. She was aged 55, which would be seen as quite old in those days. And although she had been divorced by the Fifth Earl and the marriage completely annulled, she seemed to have the temerity to continue to use the title of Countess of Argyll, and felt free to live in the better of the Campbell castles, particularly Castle Campbell at Dollar. So I suspect that the Earl just let sleeping dogs lie and let her have her head and keep away from her as much as he could. But she was later, on her death, buried next to her father, King James V, and she's in the royal vaults with her father at Holyrood Abbey. So this short presentation, I hope, has given you some ideas about who this remarkable woman was, where she came from, her life in Scotland, France, and Scotland, and finally in England. A remarkable character, masses of information about her, films, plays, music, that she's probably stimulated more literature than any other character in recent in early modern history. So thank you for watching. I hope you found this worthwhile. Goodbye.